Good evening and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for tonight's program, Strategies for Combating Misinformation. My name is Christine Billmeyer, and I am Professor of Professional Practice in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia, and I'm also the Director of the Masters in Strategic Communication. Tonight's panel is a collaboration between two SPS graduate programs, the Strategic Communication Master's Program and the Master's in Political Analytics. So to tackle this topic, we have invited an exceptional panel of individuals from each of our respective academic fields and from professional sectors that include journalism, media, public opinion research, and political psychology. Their rich experience, knowledge, and scholarship in political information will inform this discussion, and moreover, they will share their varied perspectives on how to address this critical issue. We are very fortunate to have as our moderator, Josie Cox. Josie is a journalist, an editor, a broadcaster, whose work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Guardian, Fortune, Forbes, and many other publications. She is also author of Women, Money, and Power. And Josie is an associate faculty in the School of Professional Studies Masters in Strategic Communication program. Josie will introduce the other panelists. So, the panel discussion will last for about an hour, and then we will have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So now I would like to introduce my colleague and counterpart at SPS, Greg Warrow. Greg is professor of political science at Columbia, and he is the founder and director of the Masters in Political Analytics. Greg?
Thank you, Christine. So a decade ago, it's unlikely that we would have thought that a panel like this is something that would be interesting and all that relevant, and one that would draw a crowd big enough to fill this room. And it's astounding how quickly the topic of misinformation in politics has risen to the very top of research agendas in multiple disciplines. The stakes are shockingly high. There's a compelling argument to be made that strong democracies need its citizens and representatives to agree on a common set of shared facts. Misinformation is making it harder and harder to meet that basic requirement. Democracy in the United States and abroad is under threat from many directions, with misinformation among the most pressing. I am extremely grateful for the opportunity to hear from our panel of experts on this topic and look forward to becoming better informed about misinformation. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Josie now. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Billmeyer. Thank you, Dr. Warrow. And good evening, everyone, to this absolutely remarkable venue. I have been affiliated with Columbia for several years, and I feel like I've probably walked past this building a million times, and never did I suspect that it was so fabulous inside. Has everyone seen the ceiling? It is absolutely gorgeous. Anyway, my name is Josie Cox. As Christine mentioned, I'm a journalist, I'm an author. I'm also a graduate of the business school just down the road. I was a fellow at the journalism school some years back, and at the moment I have the distinct privilege of being associate faculty here at SPS. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be moderating a conversation tonight on a topic that for so many of us is ever present in our jobs, but not just in our jobs, also in our everyday lives. It is as timely as it is complex, and as important as it is contested many times. Strategies for combating political misinformation. And I'm particularly delighted to be joined by this prestigious host of experts who come to this discussion with very different perspectives and backgrounds and areas of expertise. So I have absolutely no doubt that we will have an engaged and fascinating discourse this evening. And as mentioned, we will open it for questions after the initial discussion. So please start thinking about how you would like to pitch into the discussion and what questions I missed. So by way of introduction, just briefly, Jenn Counter immediately to my left here is VP at Orbis Operations, where she advises foreign partner governments on national security matters, including intelligence, information operations, and strategic communication. Before that, Jenn was a VP at Ipsos. She's also been a Foreign Service officer in the State Department's Regional Affairs Office and a US Air Force intelligence officer. Jenn is a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and there she provides expertise on influence, mis- and disinformation, covert action, intelligence operations. Her writing on these issues is frequently published and will form the foundation of a PhD that is in her near future. She also has a BA in political science from Boston University and an MA in global diplomacy from the University of London, SOAS, and MS in strategic communications from our very own SPS here. So she is, if there are any current students in the audience right now, this could be you. And an MA in political psychology from Arizona State University. Welcome, Jenn. Bradley Honan is the CEO and president of the Honan Strategy Group, which is a strategic public opinion research and data analytics company. He's an expert in leveraging public opinion polling data and digital analytics for strategic planning purposes. His work helps agencies, political candidates, senior government leaders, NGOs, everybody basically, to leverage public opinion data and digital analytics and to develop actionable go-to-market strategies. And Bradley's worked with a whole array of organizations and institutions, from the Clinton White House to many, many boardrooms across corporate America. Next up, we have Anya Schiffrin, delighted to be joined by Anya. She is the director of the Technology, Media, and Communications specialization at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She's also a senior lecturer who teaches on global media, innovation, and human rights. She writes on journalism and development and has published extensively over the last decade. More recently, she's become focused on solutions to the problem of online disinformation, and she earned her PhD on the topic from the University of Navarra. Anya is the editor of Global Muckracking, 100 Years of Investigative Reporting from Around the World, and African Muckracking, 75 Years of Investigative Journalism from Africa. She's also the editor of Media Capture, How Money, Digital Platforms, and Governments Control the News, which appeared via Columbia University Press back in 2021. And finally, he's been very patient. Yamil Ricardo Velez is an assistant professor of political science at Columbia University. He completed his PhD in political science at Stony Brook University and holds a BA in political science and psychology from Florida State University. His research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of racial and ethnic politics, political psychology, and political geography, with a particular focus on immigration. And before coming to Columbia, Yamil was an assistant professor at George Washington University and Wesleyan University. So welcome, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to kick off with a few questions for each panelists. But then, as I said, I will open the floor to you all to get involved. So as a sort of icebreaker question, I would love to know, let's set the scene. So how concerned are you, just briefly, and we will get to the solutions, but how concerned are you about the sort of state of disinformation and misinformation at the moment, about the power and influence that it is having on our lives and communities today, and perhaps also about the trajectory of where you see things going over the next couple of years? And I will ask, Anya, would you like to kick us off?
Well, I hate being depressing because when you teach, you have to always be cheerful, or at least find a path to solutions. But I think that the opening remarks were right, that it's a subject we're all thinking about a lot more now. And I do worry that the contribution that mis and disinformation has made to the polarization that we're experiencing is actually very serious right now. And I think even in just the last couple of months, the elections in the Netherlands, Argentina, the situation in the Middle East suggests that the sort of anger, the confusion, the distrust are having very strong political consequences around the world. So yeah, this isn't a good time to ask. I'm a little bit discouraged right now.
Okay. Who else shares Anya's less than optimistic sentiments? Yamil?
I am, I think, approach this in a very academic way and say it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
optimism and pessimism. I'm optimistic in the sense that there are a lot of people that I think are pouring a ton of time in trying to address this issue. Tons of different interventions that are being tested by academics and NGOs across the country. I'm pessimistic about whether some of the platforms will implement any of these interventions because they run into some of their, profitability motives. But I am, increasingly worried, I think, about the way that, these advances in technology, specifically generative AI, are going to affect 2024.
Okay. Jenn?
Yeah, I probably am very similar to Yamil on this. Back when I started doing disinformation on behalf of the U.S. government back in the mid-2000s, I would get really excited about, let's talk about press placements and let's talk about civil society organizations and how we can manipulate them. And my friends would look at me and just go, you're crazy and we don't want to talk to you about this. But now I think there's a lot of interest in this realm, in this sort of broad sort of piece of politics and part of communications and part of sort of behavioral science. So I'm a little bit more optimistic because at least we're finally talking about it and we are all sort of acknowledging that it's happening, which is something that is, I think, very new for most Americans. I think other places in the world, this is much more part of their sort of understanding and part of their sort of daily life is sifting out what's real and what's not real. But we haven't sort of hit that head on until really quite recently. So I'm probably a little bit more optimistic because we're having conversations like this, which would not have happened 2 years ago, let alone 5 or 10 or 20 years ago.
Totally. Yeah. Bradley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a exhibit I encourage everybody to go see, probably late summer, early fall next year, at the New York Historical Society. And what they do is they pull out of the archives the old political memorabilia going back to the founding of the Republic. And what the snapshot is that's relevant tonight is there has been disinformation and misinformation as long as there have been humans occupying Earth and talking to one another. What's changed is we now have channels and platforms that allow the velocity to move in ways we have never seen before. And so this information is becoming both pervasive, and one of the reasons it's becoming persuasive is there's so much of it. So I think this is a profoundly important issue.
And before we go any further, I know this was a question that I had when I first met you, Bradley. Just for everyone in the audience, what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
You had a better answer than me the other day, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, so I tend to frame things in terms of my mother. And so my mother will often ask me, is this real? And I will say, well, is this something that sort of is misinterpreted or is intended to be real, right? Is it just something that got sort of misconstrued in the telephone game, which happens all the time, right? It happened yesterday. It was the head of the World Health Organization making some comments about Gaza that the Israeli prime minister then said, that's not true. And I don't think that the head of the WHO is intentionally putting out bad information. I think it was misinformation. He got bad gouge and sort of ran with it, which is unfortunate. Disinformation is intended to be nefarious. It's intended to manipulate you. It's intended to be fake. Someone is intentionally putting out fake news or garbage or information that's trying to override your sensibilities and make you react on emotion, which is, if you look at disinformation, oftentimes it's it triggers that little part in your brain that's that's anger or fear. So I would say, disinformation is intentional, and misinformation is just your mother got the gist of what your aunt told her a little incorrect.
I think it's a really important distinction to make, and I think it's a good place for us to start our discussion as well. So, okay, so we've established where we're at. We've established the extent that we're optimistic and pessimistic. And I'd love to start talking a little bit about the bulk of what we're going to be discussing today, which is these potential solutions. And Anya, I'm going to come to you. I know a lot of your work has focused on potential policy solutions to combat misinformation specifically. And I know you've made this really interesting distinction between supply-side solutions and demand-side solutions. So I was wondering whether you could just give us a bit of a primer on what the distinction between those two is, and what you think the greatest hurdles to implementation of these policy frameworks have been so far.
Sure, thank you very much.
Do you want to take mine?
Or maybe,
There we
okay,
go.
we're on.
Perfect.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I guess like everybody, I started worrying about this. Some of you have been onto this problem for a long time, but I guess I started thinking about it after 2016. And at that time, when I tried to talk about mis and disinformation in my classes at SIPA, I got sort of an eye roll from my students who thought this was just an old person's problem and that they were young and sophisticated and would never be taken in. That's not true today. Now my class is full of students who are very interested, and pretty much everybody, no matter what country they're from, has a relative that's been affected in some way. So started trying to understand again, trying to be positive and think of solutions. I tried to really just focus on teaching those. And so I came up with this really handy kind of rubric, which was dividing solutions into demand and supply side. And demand side solutions are solutions that address audiences and consumers. So those would be things like media literacy, where you're teaching people to be aware of what's false and what's not true, or now I guess we call it cognitive security. All of those efforts to build trust in media so that people will actually choose quality information, to give people quality information so that they become aware of it and they want it. Those would be some of the demand side solutions. I also put fact checking in that bucket as well because it's aimed at educating people. And those are really the American solutions because we haven't been able to do any regulation. So right after 2016, we saw groups like Facebook paying for fact checking because they didn't want to get regulated. And so these seemed, and it's the American way, right? We don't necessarily think about, chemicals in the environment. We talk about smoking. When Michelle Obama came into the White House and wanted to tackle the sort of big food companies that were, creating terrible food, that got dialed back until her campaign became less move. So the American way is it's your responsibility. You need to arm yourself. You need to deal with this. On the supply side, I really have two rubrics. So some of supply side is trying to stop the supply of false information, and that can be done in many ways. You can be China and just, censor it. You can be a tech company and have a trust and safety division, or use, algorithms to try to control it. So, or you could be Europe and have the Digital Services Act, which also it puts the onus on the companies to do analyses of where the risks are and then show that they have a plan to mitigate those risks. And then the other part of the supply side is creating quality information. And that can be anything from counter messaging, counter propaganda, or the world that I'm very involved with, which is trying to support quality journalism in order to make sure that at least there's good quality information out there in the ecosystem. So that's pretty much my rubric. And it sounds simplistic, but it really works. So every time there's so many solutions and task forces and commissions and reports, but every time I hear about one of these initiatives, I know sort of where to put it. So I do recommend my taxonomy. I find it kind of a useful way of organizing information. So thanks for letting me explain it.
It makes perfect sense to me. I'd just be curious as a follow-up question to know where you see the successes concentrated at the moment. And I want to sort of delve a little bit deeper into things like media literacy later on in the conversation, because I'm sure other panelists will have views on this. But generally speaking, are you more optimistic about the supply side solutions or the demand side solutions?
I'm a fan of all of the solutions. When we look at things like media literacy, there's cases that are always held up. So Finland and Taiwan are considered the sort of big success stories for media literacy. I can say, I think that globally, media literacy has been sort of underfunded, decentralized in the US as well. You know, we don't have a national curriculum on media literacy, but I think it's obviously important. I'm also a big fan of the European regulation. I think that the US tech companies are so powerful that they're really hard to regulate, but I think regulation's sort of a nudge in a way. I mean, we'll talk more, but from what I understand, Twitter isn't even bothering to answer letters from the EU Commission at this point. I mean, they're just simply not responding. And obviously, I'm sure we'll talk about TikTok, which everybody is really, really worried about too. But I think regulation's essential. And, you know, all of those arguments about, oh, it's so big, it's so complicated, you know, Congress is old and they don't understand it. I think that's absurd. If something's big and complicated, then it even more needs to be regulated. We don't say, gee, I don't understand aviation, I'm just gonna back off and let those planes do whatever they want, right? We have a response, you know, we elect governments and one of their responsibilities is to regulate. So I think it's a must,
Speaking of things that are big and complicated, Yamil, I want to bring you into the conversation because I know that you've done a lot of work around COVID, and during the COVID rollout of vaccines around the world, particularly in certain communities, you really turned your attention to misinformation and the impact that that was having. And I think we'd all be very curious just to hear about the lessons that you learned from that very, very unique experience and how you might be applying those to sort of tackle the challenges that we're now facing currently.
Yeah, thank you. My story with at least the academic study of misinformation was basically a conversation with my grandmother, where she started talking about all of this, these you know, claims about the election that she had seen on Facebook, and I tried to find fact checkers that had addressed these claims in Spanish, her native language, and I couldn't find anything whatsoever. And for me, I was, you know, basically I was like, that raised a red flag for me that there wasn't any kind of opposing force in her life that could basically provide her with corrective information. It wasn't going to work with me because I'm her grandson, and you know she doesn't. Maybe you know she still sees me as a child. But this really, I think, kicked off this interest in trying to address this issue, not only within, let's say, the broader population, but also within minority communities like the Latino community. And so I conducted a 10-country study on COVID-19 misinformation with some colleagues, Ethan Porter at George Washington and Thomas Wood at Ohio State. And you know, we found, contrary to some of the literature that suggested that providing people with factual information, that people would backfire, they would, you know, further kind of entrench their beliefs. We observed movement, so people did move in the direction of the corrections, so their beliefs became more accurate. Basically, we were able to offset some of the misinformation. However, we found that there was very little effect in terms of actual behavioral intention and attitudes. We were able to change people's beliefs. We were able to change their minds, but not their hearts in some ways. So this kind of project, in some ways, mirrors other work on fact-checking that finds similar patterns, that you can provide people with factual information, their beliefs will change, but you can't change how they vote. You can't change whether they'll turn out or not. And so right now, my research agenda is really kind of focused now on assessing what are ways that you know, facts can actually translate into behavior, as opposed to just changing people's beliefs.
That's absolutely fascinating. And Jenn and I have had a conversation ahead of this panel with Bradley as well around what you're touching on around the English language bias and how a lot of the solutions that are being trialed and introduced to combat misinformation are still very centered on the English-speaking community. And so, Jenn, I'm going to come to you. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you around that, why that still is in this day and age when we're having such wide-ranging conversations, at least, you know, compared to a few years ago, around this topic. Why is English still the go-to language?
Yeah, so fascinating, and I pulled some data before this panel because I didn't want to put out my own misinformation, but it was really interesting. So I was at a conference this summer at Cambridge University in the UK, and Frances Haugen, the Facebook former employee whistleblower, spoke, and she spoke a lot about Facebook content moderation, which kind of goes to this. And Facebook Meta tracks 40 to 50 languages, right? there's a lot more than 40 to 50 languages in the world, right? And many people who speak other languages are on the platform. And what she really highlighted that I think is pertinent to mention was that spending on content moderation was not based on the need. So the number of people engaging on the platform, in this case Facebook, based on language, but on the consequences, right? So, are you gonna get pulled in front of Congress and embarrassed on, national television? And as a result, the focus is on English, with 87% of all content moderation on Facebook as of 2020 focusing on English, which is kind of astounding when you think about it, especially because only 9% of all Facebook users are English speakers. So that leaves out a massive number of people in the world, right? And so that's interesting data. And then I'm gonna touch on something that I think Bradley knows a lot more than I on. WhatsApp, right? We don't really when we think about disinformation, misinformation, we oftentimes think about Facebook and Twitter and sort of those apps. We don't think about our chat apps that we all use every day. And for many people in the world, WhatsApp is like their phone, right? That is how they communicate. And just to give a sense of how global the problem is, mis and disinformation was massively spread using WhatsApp in these recent elections in the last 5 years or so. Zimbabwe, Brazil, the US, which includes, in this case, WhatsApp and WeChat, Nigeria, Spain, India, Pakistan, Mexico, Lebanon, Taiwan. So looking forward in 2024, and this is where we get to sort of Bradley's area, there's going to be 83 national level elections in 78 countries. Wow. So think about the volume of people who are going to receive content via social platforms, to include our chat apps that we can have groups of 20 or 50 or 100 or more going directly to people, right? So if you receive content from someone you know and trust, you're far more likely to believe it. So, Bradley, how would you use all of this in an election?
I think this is where, Jen, we move from people that are critical of a discussion like this and say that's an ivory tower debate. No, this is very, very, very practical. Here's what's going to be different so far from what I can see about 2024 compared to elections domestically, and we'll talk international later, in the United States. The swing voter group, all of the attention from the candidates, the political parties, has traditionally been middle income, middle class, white people. What the polling is saying right now is where Trump, who's probably, in my view, going to become the Republican nominee, is doing particularly well, and where President Biden is doing particularly weak, are a couple of groups. African Americans, AAPI, Latinos, Hispanics, and a lot of the people in this room, those who are under 30. And for a variety of reasons we can talk about, media consumption being foremost in that, but also the presence of disinformation, misinformation, and the lack of policing mean that this could be the decisive issue in the 2024 US presidential election, and that ain't hyperbole.
Of course, please.
Wondering what you think of the Spanish language fact-checking groups like Chequeado, Maldito.es, because I know that they're really focusing a lot on WhatsApp. I was wondering if they've reached your grandmother.
No, they haven't. So Fact Chequeado is still relatively new, so I don't think they've really penetrated into some of these communities yet. Telemundo and Univision have had their own fact-checking arm since 2016. So this is almost 2 decades after the first fact-checking arms show up in English language news. So basically, fact-checking is a relatively new institution within the Spanish language media world, and they largely paused fact-checking the Spanish language networks between 2016 and 2020. They resumed it a month before the election. And so that's the big concern is investing, I think, more in these fact-checking units in Spanish.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll be looking to see is you had all those networks of journalists in Brazil and in Mexico during the elections who put aside their differences and fact-checked together all the different outlets. So, interesting to see whether that continues to spread. I know some of the Brazilian fact-checkers, many of them actually studied at Columbia, didn't feel felt disappointed, because then somebody still has to do something with it, right? You call it Meta and say, this is a problem. Are they going to take it down or not? You don't necessarily know, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Bradley, just coming back to you, I know that you've done a little bit of work around the role that local media and regional media can play in combating misinformation. Anya, I'm sure that's something that's close to your heart as well. Considering all the conversations that we're having around news deserts, both across the US and elsewhere, under-resourced newsrooms, journalists who are not necessarily qualified or not necessarily equipped to provide the kind of reporting that we would need to ensure that misinformation doesn't creep into journalism. How are you thinking about the role of local news going forward?
Well, I have 3 of my family members have a title in their resume called fact checker. And that's a title which is not on as many resumes today as it should be, or a part of the vocabulary of a lot of the sites. I think that the answer, there's no silver bullet. There are a lot of important players in this, and I think giving local media outlets an opportunity to get financing through a lot of nonprofits, a lot of foundations that are doing very important work to keep them alive, creates more transparency, creates more sunlight. What I've been actually very encouraging about, because you want to be positive here tonight, is something we were talking about before. I did some work around COVID vaccinations, similar to you, in particular in the Bangladeshi community in the outer boroughs of New York City. And what I was very encouraged by were community leaders who said, we have to combat this information, give us the tools, give us the resources, give us the citations, particularly for local media and peer-to-peer media, which has more credibility and trust than anything else, to allow us to go out and combat disinformation. So democracy is a participation sport, and I think we've all got to be a part of the solution, and I think local media is a big, big part of it because it's closest to people, and right now it's seen as one of the most trusted channels of anything out there right now.
And let me ask you this, when the Bangladeshi community made these demands for the tools and resources to make sure that they had these fact checks in place, were they given them?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think this was something that there was a big strain of viral communications around the vaccine about how women were going to go sterile if they took it.
Yeah.
And so there was a big uprising of community activists that said, we need the tools, we need facts, we need scientists that look like us, scientists that sound like us, scientists that speak in the local dialect, and we need our local news sources to help amplify that information, because those are more credible than other outlets, even more mainstream national news outlets.
Yeah, sure. Anya, do you think that local newsrooms are given the credit that they deserve for being potential parts of the solution to misinformation?
That's a really interesting. I mean, when I covered local news, it was pretty polarizing, actually. I think it's easy to imagine, I found it, local news, to be sort of a battleground when I was covering school boards in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and we had the largest teacher strike in the state. I mean, the town was really furious. But a few thoughts on local news. One is that because of the budget cuts in New York City, city advertising budgets are getting cut very dramatically, and I've been very impressed. I mean, I'm not a strategic communications professional like people in this room, but I've been really impressed at how much good information there is in New York in all kinds of languages. Just anecdotally, when I think of the people I know that aren't very literate or only speak Spanish, they get a lot of information. So I think that's really, really powerful. But otherwise, I've been, like you, like Brad, very inspired by groups like the American Journalism Project, all of these initiatives that are tapping local foundations to support local news. I think that's really, really key. Personally, I just released a paper written with a bunch of economists arguing that Google and Meta should be giving far more money to publishers, that they've been distributing the content for years and dramatically underpaying publishers.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see billions being transferred from the large tech companies to publishers around the world, actually. I think that would help solve some of the funding crisis.
It's really interesting you say that. I spent some time last year in Youngstown, Ohio, which is a news desert, and which has also a very rich and interesting history of polarization and, I mean, every large issue that has been battled by America in the last 50 years, it feels like Youngstown has experienced. And I met with some local journalists there, and all of them were saying, where's the money from Meta? Where's the money from Google? So you're very much in agreement with them.
That's to be
there.
continued, because not everybody accepts that. Now, Youngstown started a nonprofit news site. Were you working with those?
I wasn't directly working with them, but I met some people who were working on it, and I was quite encouraged by the amount of interest and the awareness and recognition of the importance of local media, particularly in a community like that. But I think only time will tell whether that momentum will continue, particularly into the next election cycle. But Bradley.
Can I ask a question of my fellow panelists?
Please.
So the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, speaks only English with literally a handful of Spanish words in his dialect. One of the things that he's doing to communicate with New Yorkers about city services, about events going on in people's community, is using generative AI. And what that means
You
is
beat me
that
to the punch.
What's that?
You beat me. I was going to
I'm
ask about
sorry,
that,
I'm
but go
taking
ahead.
thunder.
Take my thunder. Go.
So he is now, we have the mayor who is now speaking fluent Mandarin, fluent Spanish, almost every language you can communicate. And my question for the panelists is that misinformation or disinformation? And it's created some controversy because some of the local news sites have been pushing that out as content for their readers.
Yamil.
I think properly flagged, for me, it's fine in the sense that we're reducing language barriers. I mean, so one of the biggest increases that you see in turnout within Latino communities, specifically in under-resourced communities, is providing ballots in Spanish. There's a famous study in political science found pretty large increases in places that were covered by the VRA to provide foreign language assistance in terms of ballots. So for me, I think about language barriers, and if you're Spanish dominant, you're not getting information in any other way, I'm not opposed to it as long as it's flagged and it's not passed off as if he's fluent in Spanish.
But I do think one problem is nobody notices labels, and then it starts, helping him with elections because everybody thinks, wow, he's fluent in my language. So I don't know, but it probably is a good thing in a way because it conveys information too.
Jen,
I don't know what
what do
everyone
you
else
think?
thinks.
So generative AI, at first I was like, oh, it's not gonna be a big deal. Everybody's gonna know that it's fake, right? The picture's gonna have somebody with 8 fingers and weird hair, and it's gonna be very clear. But it's gotten a lot better very quickly, and that's concerning because even if it's not believable, right? Somebody only has 6 fingers instead of the 8. There's gonna be so much of it.
Yeah.
Especially as we come into elections around the world, as we deal with new crises, Israel-Gaza. I won't sort of derail us on Israel-Gaza because I know it's a hot button issue, especially on this campus. But there has been some generative AI content pushed out on social media that's really inflaming things more than it already is, right? And so my concern around generative AI is that it's going to democratize disinformation even more than it already is. And if people just won't know what to believe, right? Unless it's labeled, but then is the label really true, right? It's not like, the cereal boxes where that things have been vetted by the Food and Drug Administration. It's going to be really tricky and ugly.
And Jennifer, I think also what the sort of AI experts are worried about is the personalization. And that is apparently going to make the whole thing much more realistic and believable.
So now Mayor Adams might be speaking, Mandarin, but that wasn't what he said.
Right.
It looks real, but maybe not.
It's a game of telephone, right? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say? No. Yamil, yeah.
Yeah,
please.
I wanted to comment on generative AI, so I teach an experimental research class every year where we try to tackle some issue. So last year was affective polarization. Every student submitted an intervention. We tested it as a class. We tried to find what was the winning intervention, and did it move outcomes in the intended direction. This year was generative AI.
Wow.
So we wanted to see, can you actually improve detection of deep fakes and images that have been created using these methods? And we tested 12 different interventions. Really smart Columbia students who were reading the literature, coming up with best practices that have been written on misinformation, like flagging, providing provenance information, where you're giving people information about the source, inoculation, messaging, all of that. We tested 12 different interventions, only one worked, and it only improved accuracy by 1%.
Oh my goodness.
So out of all of the, and we canvassed the literature to make sure that we had a representative set of interventions, and the best performing one only boosted accuracy by 1%.
And tell us a little bit more about that particular intervention.
This was a flagging. So this
Okay.
was a case where it's watermarked,
Yeah.
and so where it was, basically indicated that that this information was AI generated.
Can I just point out too, if for those who are sort of political wonks in the room, you may be familiar with the magazine Campaigns and Elections, which is, and what's interesting about that is not necessarily the articles that they write about campaigns, but who advertises and who that magazine is putting out as a sponsor. And in the last 6 months or so, there's more and more generative AI companies offering their wares for upcoming elections, right? So if you're running a small, you're in a city, you want to be on the city council, now you too can have your own generative AI, social media content generator. You don't necessarily have to hire the 10 interns. So it's really interesting that there's now this little sub-economy growing around not just big ChatGPT and big sort of the AI that we know, but also these little boutique firms who are in it for political reasons, right? They are advertising themselves as political companies, which I think is something to keep an eye on.
Totally. And despite all the risks that we're already flagging around the potential bad consequences of generative AI, we also still have to remember that generative AI is still in its infancy, right? So, Bradley, I'd be curious to hear from you. We talked a little bit before the panel about this competition for attention in the media, and how is that projected to escalate as a result of generative AI becoming far more sophisticated in not years to come, weeks to come?
Yeah, and I think that the challenge is right now that I'm a native New Yorker, and so my New York City example is people are consuming every day, the average person, 265 feet of content on their phone every day. That's higher than the Statue of Liberty. Scroll, 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 scroll some more. You get the idea. And so not only is it very, very difficult to be heard if you're a company or a politician that's trying to set the record straight or say something truthful, but it's incredibly competitive between local news and capturing eyeballs, which at the end of the day is where you're able to monetize your content and charge advertisers for drawing people in. The problem is the algorithms always get a lot of blame, and we'll hear tonight, feeds you the kinds of things that are incendiary. They're not typically white papers about how to improve inequality or how to address global warming. They're generally fear-mongering and hysterical things. I think the other thing, Jen, picking up on what you had said, is you may remember a silly example of Mr. Big having a heart attack on the sitcom out of Sex and the City. So that has sitcom, fake, not real. What happens? The number of people that are Googling, can you have a heart attack when you're on a Peloton? Can you have a heart attack when you're exercising? Goes like this. And the stock price the next day goes like this. So with all, absolutely, they lost a hell of a lot of money. And so with all of the disclosures that this is a phony sitcom done by Hollywood, it's actually changing behavior of sophisticated people down on Wall Street that are selling the stock and reducing the share price.
I feel like this whole conversation, we've been dancing around this idea of media literacy, and we've touched on it briefly, but I'd love to go there properly right now, because I think that the idea of media literacy in the US can quite quickly become a discussion around censorship. And I would just love to hear all of your opinions, actually, on this distinction between protection and policing, between censorship and quality control, I guess. Can that balance ever be struck?
I'd like to start with a little history lesson, which is, do you know where one of the first media literacy programs in the country took place?
Was it right here?
Columbia Teachers College. In the 1930s, this became my pandemic project. There was a guy called, a former journalist called Clyde Miller, who came to Columbia in the 1930s, and he got funding from Filene, the department store magnate in Boston, and he started the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And he started at Columbia Teachers College, and they produced a lot of publications, a lot like what's done today, actually. He did sort of taxonomies of propaganda techniques and little guides for sort of how to tell when someone's lying, newsletters that he sent to teachers all around the country. You could subscribe, and every month he would do a case study. He would take a hot button topic that was in the news and then explain, you know, propaganda about the Spanish Civil War or something about Father Coughlin. They did a lot of work on Father Coughlin. And of course, as you know, in the 1920s, 1930s, in the post-war period, everybody's very, very worried about propaganda, especially after World War I. So it's a terrible ending, because what happened was the sort of the Dies Committee, the pre-McCarthy era, the people that did this work started being tainted as sort of premature anti-fascists. And when you talked about the New York Historical Society, they have wonderful posters there from the 1930s. I'm sure you saw that exhibit. The anti-propaganda scholars also got very involved in promoting anti-racist education. This was a really big thing in the 1920s and 1930s, because they said racism is actually the worst form of propaganda that there is. They piloted something in Springfield, Massachusetts, which conservative Catholics hated because it taught that Muslims and Jews were as good as everybody else. And so they were politically attacked. Some of them ended up being blacklisted. Clyde Miller was fired by Columbia. Amazingly, in the archives, I even found a letter from him begging for his apartment, which I immediately sent to Bollinger and the provost. I was like, something's never changed. He was trying so hard to find his apartment. And also they were told that they sort of fell out of fashion, because polling and public opinion and propaganda sort of started to seem quaint, and they were too paranoid. And it's interesting, because there's been such a backlash now against many of the women that work on disinformation. So many of them have had huge problems, the subpoenas, the congressional hearings. And it reminds me that when a society becomes really polarized, even studying propaganda or disinformation becomes unacceptable. And lots of people now won't even use those words, right? Disinformation, misinformation. They're talking about cognitive security, because they're trying not to antagonize the Republicans. So anyway, couldn't resist a little historical background there.
I do love a good history lesson, but what about media literacy in schools? Is that ever going to happen? And I'll give Anya a break to drink. But no, I mean, whoever wants to, Jenn, yeah.
I think, you know, yes, we need it, right? And it doesn't have to be scary censorship, right? I think that sort of like ferocious part of our national psyche, that, you know, freedom of speech, and we all want and respect that. But at some point, we need to teach our kids, you know, what the Finns are teaching their kids, which is, who wrote this article? When did they write this article? What arguments are they making this article, and why might they be making that argument? Are reasonable questions to teach kids and adults sort of, you know, what is bias and why are people trying to manipulate you? You know, the Swedes have a wonderful organization called the Psychological Defense Agency, which sort of doesn't run afoul of the populace because their mandate is very, very clear. We won't police, we won't track communications that originate from Swedish citizens or inside of Sweden, but we are going to pay attention and research and analyze and try to track, offensive campaigns against us by known adversaries. And for the Swedes, that's predominantly Russia. And so because their mandate is so clear and they abide by it in the same way that the intelligence community in the US abides by 12333, which says that American intelligence community is not going to spy on Americans, it's trusted and it's okay. And it's not this censorship machine that we as Americans, I think, really fear. There are some organizations out there that are trying to sort of chip away at this. One is the Disarm Foundation. You may or may not agree with their sort of approach and their, matrix for identifying and sort of educating people on influence campaigns and mis and disinformation. But it's a resource, and it's, if people can sort of get off of their phones and stop the scroll, stop the insanity, and have a conversation with people, and we can support local journalists again, I think we can start to chip away at where we've gotten, which is the doom scroll of chaos and fear and anger that's often not true because it's,
Can I ask a question? How do you rebuild after a period of collapse, like a World War II or something like that? Do you know?
I mean, you have to find sort of your champion, right? You have to find someone who people trust, who is sort of the spokesperson, who is the trusted agent, who can then start to lead people in the righteous sort of path, whatever that might be. But that's hard, and I don't know that we have that right now. There's no sort of American that I'm aware of who can sort of stand up in front of big groups and say, this is going to hurt, but we need to do it. Can we all just coalesce around it? Because you're going to have people on Facebook, the trolls, sort of tearing them down. So, yeah, I don't have the right answer, but I think there are interventions, and media literacy is a big first step.
Yeah, I was going to say the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 brought us, I think, a movement toward let's have greater financial literacy. Let's help kids understand, college students understand how to balance a paycheck and a bank statement. I think we saw over the summer the Eras Tour has brought us now courses on Taylor Swift. I think one here at Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. I think the focus around disinformation is shining a new light on the importance of being media literate, digitally literate, and even though we have very, very pronounced differences geographically and politically in this country, one of the things that does stand out to me is when you talk to Americans about disinformation, misinformation being a place of national weakness, of being a place potentially of a national security threat. If we're fighting one another, we're not aware of the incoming fire, literally or figuratively. And I think there's a desire to do much more. I think the challenge is, I used to work at a public relations company called Edelman that does something called a trust barometer every year. And they've looked at trust towards government. It's been going down, down, down. Trust in media going down, down, down. Maybe there's somebody sitting here in the room who's going to become the Walter Cronkite, who's going to be the person who's looked to Barbara Walters as the person that America can trust and relate to and be able to help rebuild some of those bonds about how do we level set the information, at least the facts we can agree on, and let's disagree. But I think there's going to be a move to greater digital and media literacy. And I think we're going to see actually a lot more bipartisan consensus than we typically do.
I think that's wonderful to have that optimism. I think that that sounded patronizing in that.
The answer is sitting in front of us. I don't know how we can't be optimistic.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that is one thing that we can look to for hope. I think the assumption there is that there is a self-awareness that misinformation exists. And I still think that in many communities, individuals are so entrenched in their own beliefs that they are actually blind to this idea that misinformation is having an adverse effect.
I think that from what I'm seeing right now, there are issues where there are a lot of squabbles about, no, there's not disinformation here, but it exists on that issue. In other words, your disinformation is different than mine. Where I think there is consensus is that technology has empowered what I would call information terrorists. And again, your set of issues may be different than mine, but there does seem to be consensus that there is a problem out there. Maybe wokeism for me, it may be wokeism for you, or it could be factism for you, or factism. So the issues are different, but I think there actually is a lot more consensus out there.
Yamil, I want to give you the opportunity to pitch on the media literacy point as well.
Yeah, so I think this is actually, this might be more of a supply side intervention. So for the past 2 years, I've been collaborating with Spanish language journalists who actually communicate via WhatsApp to these huge audiences. And they're trained journalists, they're trained to fact check, and every day they have La Hora de Cafecito. This person's Maritza Felix at Conecta Arizona. Every single hour, she has a discussion with hundreds of people about the topic of the day. It could be, cancer awareness. It could be the upcoming primaries, and this is a place where, instead of putting the onus on individuals to, equip themselves with the skills to identify misinformation, she's filling an important gap in some of these, news deserts in her community, specifically in southern Arizona. And so I think that this is a place where you can also, putting individuals in connection with local journalists can also be another form of kind of boosting these digital literacy skills. It's not like an infographic, it's not a course that you're taking, but you are now interfacing with someone who can kind of guide you through the news of the day. Now, granted, very few people do this. She's one of these exceptions. She gets, she's been getting a lot of grant support lately. I'm so happy for her. But we need more kind of Maritzas out there. We need more kind of trusted journalists that are out there and connecting with people, in more informal settings, as opposed to just, through news reports or traditional media.
So she's funded by foundations?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Yeah. Again, that's what we were just talking about. This is your 3-minute warning to get all your questions ready. So I'm going to ask one more question to sort of...
Can I just say one more thing?
Of course.
I think New Jersey just passed a media literacy requirement.
And California as well,
Does
right?
anybody on the panel know anything about that? Because I'd love to hear more. What I was hearing from my students last spring was that in many of the states they come from, like Missouri, they were saying it would just be too controversial. You couldn't actually get that passed at this point. But I'm curious about New Jersey.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got about 3 more minutes of me interrogating you before we open it to the floor. As a sort of wrap-up question, and I know this is a difficult one to answer, but do your best in a minute each. Having reflected on so many aspects of the potential solutions to misinformation and disinformation, with whom do you think the responsibility ultimately lies? If you had to give one person the responsibility or one party the responsibility, is it the individual, is it the state, is it corporations? Who has the power to affect the greatest change in this particular domain? Don't all shout at once.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's a great question.
Why, thank you.
Because no one trusts anybody anymore, right? I mean, when you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, who do people trust the most? Is it still military officers?
You and I, it's people like us.
It's
your peers.
Yeah, so, I mean, maybe it's time to start to rebuild some community groups, the Elks and the Knights of Columbus and the Girl Scouts and all of these things that again, get people off the doom scroll and communicating with actual people who they will then realize oh, maybe we are more similar than different. And oh, I heard this thing. Have you heard this thing? Oh, no, that sounds crazy. Oh, it is crazy. So I think a lot of it is just becoming people again.
Good answer.
I think supply-side solutions are really important because they scale. I think that, you know, teaching somebody media literacy will take a really long time, whereas telling Meta you're going to get a huge thwacking fine, or TikTok if you do that, is more efficient. It's probably less democratic, but more efficient. I'm not even sure it's less democratic.
But it's more efficient. And,
Yeah. So yeah.
I think it's really hard to put the onus on the individual, again, now as we enter this generative AI age, where, you know, these algorithms are effectively trained on the ability for humans not to spot the difference. You know, we've gotten to this level of quality. And so, again, this experience I've had with my students this semester of trying our best to figure out interventions to improve the problem, and just finding that the best one like moves people by a percent has made me very pessimistic about, like, can you arm people with this information so they can spot whether they're encountering anything that's trying to persuade them. I think, yeah, a lot of the onus might have to come down to the tech companies. One popular intervention that's being discussed now is provenance. So the idea is basically anytime you upload something online, you are providing information about the source. You're digitally signing it, so you're attributing responsibility to you as an individual for putting that online. And I think that's maybe a promising path forward, where we at least can figure out where the information's coming from. And even if they're not trustworthy sources, at least it's out there and there's transparency. But yeah, I can't place the onus on individuals given what we're confronting.
And I guess the next step there after providence is implementing some kind of sanction if that providence is not accurate, or having some kind of mechanism in place to ensure that it's actually effective and that it's incentivized, right?
I was going to say there was an interesting example of this, and this is very, very small stuff here, and this is probably misinformation than it is disinformation. So George Santos gets expelled from the House of Representatives on Friday, and the governor of New York, or at least the person who manages her Twitter feed, says, I'm looking forward to naming the replacement of George Santos. In fact, the governor's constitutional responsibility ends by calling an election date. She decides the election date. She doesn't decide who the candidates are. And so X, Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, crowdsourced ideas to say, underneath her post, actually, what she has a constitutional responsibility to do is to name the date of the election, not the candidates. So I don't think that the technology companies are going to get there by themselves. I think it's going to require a lot of grassroots outrage to get them there. But I think there are very, very powerful tools that they have at their disposal. There's polling by the Pew Charitable Trust saying that TikTok is going to be the major source of information, political news, for 30% of the electorate. So I think the media companies, particularly the social media companies, are going to be the primary linchpin to correct a lot of this. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think that's where, frankly, I'm optimistic.
And it should put an end to all of us old people saying we're not on TikTok, because that's only for the youth of today. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Questions from the audience? You've had plenty of time to think. So do I have a microphone in the, yeah, perfect. So I think we have a question up here. And when you stand up to ask your question, can you just tell us who you are as well? Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, just to say thank you so much. This is such an important and fascinating conversation. My name's Tricia Bauman, and I'm with SBS Stratcom Associate Faculty. And my question is, to what extent might the EU be in fact, an influence on how these issues are going to be evolving from this supply side standpoint? And I'm thinking of the digital, what is it called? Sorry? Yeah, and I'm thinking, because I work in sustainability in terms of the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is influencing US companies that have a footprint in Europe and are in that marketplace. And so I'm wondering, to what extent might the EU, even with the elections that we've just seen in Holland and elsewhere, perhaps be a silver lining, or in the vanguard in a positive way on these issues?
Yeah, just I'm thinking more from a cultural than probably the policy side, which Anya is, I think, would be better positioned to answer. But culturally, the Europeans feel the threat more than we do, right? I think the Europeans understand what sort of propaganda and influence campaigns have done to the continent on several occasions, and are more keenly attuned to what can happen as a result of Russia or others stirring the pot. So I think they're going to be better positioned emotionally and culturally and socially to take this on in a way that we, with our two very large oceans and sort of isolationist kind of perspective on the world, aren't able and unwilling to. But in terms of like GDPR and sort of some of the more policy frameworks that they have in place, I think probably maybe Anya's better positioned to answer that.
I completely agree. And our colleague Anu Bradford from Columbia Law School has published a book this fall called Digital Empires. And she argues that there's sort of three paths, right? There's the China path, there's the US path, and there's the European path, which is very, more rights-based, whereas in the US it was all about, innovation, let them do whatever they want. And Anu coined the phrase the Brussels effect, which was precisely what you're talking about, the idea that what the EU can do can spread around the world. And I think that a lot of Americans, academics, policy people are really rooting for the European regulations because it just seems much, with all their flaws, what other alternative do we have? This total laissez-faire non-regulation of the US is not working, and I don't think anybody wants to be China. So it's basically the best option out there. So.
And even if it's not a sort of wholesale adoption of the European way, at least sort of incremental elements of what we're seeing over there.
Some things like the ad libraries,
Right.
Some things start in Europe and spread, as you pointed out, the privacy laws. So,
GDPR,
I think a lot of us are rooting for Brussels. Although I understand, I was just in Berlin recently and having some conversations, and I understand that, as you would expect, they're a bit behind schedule and sort of in scaling up. The national regulators all need to staff up in order to implement the Digital Services Act, and I understand they're a bit behind schedule, but hopefully they'll get there soon.
Thank you for that question. That's great. Let's go for one at the back, right in the middle over there. Yep. Yep.
Okay, sorry. I'll go really quick. Sorry, my name's Leah Cahan. I'm a prospective student just here tonight. Thank you guys so much for everything that you shared. I just had a quick question. I know that we established earlier in the evening the difference between misinformation and disinformation in terms of the motives and what that type of false information looks like. But going back to the solution side of things, Anya, I know you established that really wonderful framework for helping us understand different types of solutions. I'm curious if you see those solutions really differing for misinformation and disinformation, or if they really are the same.
I feel like that's almost Jennifer's territory because disinformation is often from foreign actors, right?
Yes, and from an American context, it often is, unless it's sort of a political campaign and you're trying to besmirch your competitor. It can be, in terms of, some of it might be how far it spreads, right? So, sort of harmless misinformation, your mother got the family gossip a little bit wrong, is not going to impact hundreds of thousands of people or not be shared with hundreds of thousands of people. But if it is misinformation and it goes wild, like the WHO or the Santos example, then it probably needs to be managed the same way as disinformation. Ultimately, someone who puts out misinformation oftentimes will recant themselves or fact check themselves or come out and be like, oh, whoa, that is not what I meant. And it sort of self-corrects. But generally speaking, especially I would argue in mass on the digital space, it probably needs to be managed the same because it's going to have real impacts even if you didn't intend it to. That jives with everybody else?
Thank you.
Do you see a difference, Yamil, in terms of
I largely agree with that at some point you have to think about impact as opposed to intention. It's how many people is this deceiving, and I largely agree with that.
the anti-vax people, a lot of that is, what's the motivation there, would you say? Not the individuals, but the sort of wholesale pushing it. Is that to sow distrust? Does that make money? Like, what are those people doing, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied those organizations enough to say anything that about their intention, but my sense is that these are often communities that have pretty well-developed beliefs about vaccination and then are trying to get their message out there.
Let's go to the back, the patient person who has had their hand up for a while, and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you very much for doing this talk. This is really incredible. I'm very interested in the topic of disinformation, and I'm curious what you might have to say, not to be the skeptic in the room, but is there room for skepticism or a human kind of skepticism with disinformation? And does the kind of regulation of disinformation lead to potential avenues for censorship, especially given the US context and the kind of catching up that we need to do in terms of a global society with media outlets in the world?
I'm a big fan of skepticism. I think we should all be skeptics. Like, how do you know that? Why do you know that? Are you an expert in this? Like, how do you know that that vaccine's gonna work? Those are all reasonable questions, right? That is holding people accountable for what they're putting out into the world. I think that's totally valid. You know, there is, sort of sidetrack just a little bit, there's a researcher out of Cambridge University named Sandra von der Lieden, who I'm sure Yamil is familiar with, who is, you know, really pitching this idea of inoculation, right? So tell people ahead of time, hey, listen, during this upcoming election, the Russians or the whoever are going to try to manipulate us, and this is what they're gonna say, right? They're gonna say on the issue of abortion or immigration or whatever, know that these things are probably gonna come your way, so that you see it and you go, oh, yeah, okay, that's clearly the problem. That might be one way to get around sort of this sort of censorship kind of idea, but then the person inoculating you with the pre-bunking information has to be trusted themselves, right? That's the key, is like, they have to be kind of like a saint in terms of information.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, and one drawback with some of those inoculation interventions is it does increase skepticism toward misinformation, but also increases skepticism toward credible information. And so this is like a balancing act that folks have been working through about like how to have these inoculation messages really target the misinformation as opposed to credible news information. Yeah.
Yamil, I think we all need your bibliography. You have really read all the literature. It's wonderful, thank you.
And I also think this conversation around inoculation necessarily introduces this theme of bias, right, which all of us are so familiar with, but around availability bias, recency bias, how all of these things can actually, I was going to say inhibit the inoculation process, but also just shape it, right? So it's a really interesting conversation to have. Right here at the front. Oh, sorry. Oh, the mic's back there, actually. Let's go back first and then we'll come
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. It was mentioned that you in your study, you were able to change the belief of the people, but not the heart of the people. And I know that we're talking about misinformation, disinformation. I was just wondering if panelists can talk about if this is the reason that we are divided not only in the United States but all over the world, but the division was there, and actually having misinformation and disinformation is the food for that division that was already there. And as a result, to combat the misinformation and disinformation, isn't it right to first combat that root, if that is actually the root cause? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question, because one way of viewing the misinformation problem is that it's simply something that people who already have strong beliefs are using to justify their worldviews and their positions. It's not persuading many people. The idea is that you already have your deeply entrenched belief, and you're just now filling your head with things that confirm your worldview. And so there are some scholars that have been studying other ways of addressing the problem, and it's in some ways it's like indirect. So it's not fact-checking, it's not inoculation. Instead, it's finding ways of trying to reduce the strength of people's partisan identities, to reduce animosity toward the other side. And so this is almost getting at that question of what if you target the heart here? So like you're targeting people's, let's say if they have this deep level of animosity toward the other party, if you can somehow get them to lower the temperature, they might be less susceptible to misinformation. The literature, I think, is still kind of not there yet, but it is promising, I think. You know, it moves beyond just factual information. It gets into something that might be at the core of why people believe these falsehoods.
In terms of our actors using existing fissures, absolutely. So when I was putting out disinformation about terrorist organizations, I would try to identify what is the fissures between the terrorist group and the host nation, the people that are not involved, right? And how do I widen that gap so that the people we like and want to prop up go after the terrorists in one way or another, or force them out, or reduce their ability to operate. So the quickest and easiest way, and the way that, again, got people to react because they got very emotional, and that emotion overrode their sort of practical sensibilities, was to find that issue that like really got people in the gut and just turn up the volume. So yes.
We have a mic. Oh, hi. Sorry. Okay, you'll be next, I promise. Let's go to the back first.
Hi, I'm Nahima. I'm an epidemiologist, and I work in impact and audience research, specifically in the science journalism and media space. So kind of a mini comment when we talk about language accessibility, and then a question that I have. It's not even just like grandmas who can't get access to information. It's almost like 80% of peer-reviewed articles are written in English, right? How many communities, how many STEM professionals whose job it is to know this can't even get access to the information if they wanted it? So I think that's kind of a structural situation that we think about. I'm really interested in, you know, marginalized communities and thinking about harm reduction and bringing them to the table when we think about these stories that we tell about misinformation. When we're talking about things like climate change or COVID that impact, you know, communities of color or different marginalized communities, are there ways that you're thinking about, what questions are you asking yourself about the disinformation for different marginalized communities that you've worked with in the past, or that you're thinking about like, all right, for the next election, we've got to hit these people because there's something really happening here?
Great question, thank you. Yamil, I feel like this is in your wheelhouse.
So I really think, I mean, I have a strong preference for bottom-up solutions in this area, so I don't think PolitiFacts should just parachute into different communities with fact checks or something. I think you should, you know, build a stronger local news infrastructure. We should fund this. Like, it's not something that's gonna come out of thin air. But my take is that, you know, many of these approaches, if we want to target, if we want to address this issue within marginalized communities, has to come from, from the bottom up, as opposed to being imposed from the top down by various media organizations or fact-checking organizations that might not have strong connections to those communities.
Thank you. Brad, yeah.
I was going to say, we as a country have decided that there are some common shared priorities. So we have an organization called the National Science Foundation, and we have things like the National Institute of Health and the National Humanities Society. There are government entities that are using government money, taxpayer money, to promote things like cancer research, and the National Endowment for the Arts, which opens museums and libraries and funds scholarly journals. So we have done this kind of work, I think, in other places. Some of those things have been politicized for sure, but if we think this is a common national priority of identifying and cleaning up misinformation and disinformation, it seems to me that there are examples of where the country has done this generally pretty well, and generally, with a couple of exceptions, to large bipartisan agreement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's fascinating. Let's come to the front here.
All right, thank you. I'm very interested in, I think an overriding theme to what we've been talking about has been sort of size and scale of the problem and the solution. And there's been talk about, well, you know, good luck trying to regulate Meta or trying to regulate Google. Also, some solutions that have been brought up have been talking about like the Bangladeshi community in New York, or this, I think it was in Arizona, this, right? And so I'm just very interested in what is sort of, given that we have maybe limited resources to dedicate towards a solution, is it better to try to, you know, take on Meta and Fox News and all of these like larger organizations? I get that sense from you, Anya. Or right, if we can only do so much, is it better to focus on these smaller communities, but we have to focus on more of them and try to win over hearts and minds there?
Anya, do you want to?
I guess I feel like, yes, I did sort of come down on the supply side, but I'm willing to believe something else. It was also, you know, I did my dissertation on this taxonomy, and what was so interesting was in all those years of research, nobody from any of the platforms would ever speak to me. And so many times I would say that, you know, at a dinner party or something, and somebody would say, oh, no, you've got to call my friend. She works at Google. She'll definitely talk to you. And I would say, no, she really won't. And over and over again. Whereas every single time I went to Brussels, any civil servant whatsoever would spend an hour with me answering my questions. So that may have affected my view, but I started to feel like I really understood what they were trying to do, and I respected their emphasis over and over again. I had so many conversations with the regulators and saw how deeply they were thinking about human rights and free expression. So I definitely moved as I was doing my research, and as I started writing, I became more of a supply sider.
And I know this sounds like an obvious question, but I'd be curious to hear your answer. Why do you think that no one from the big tech companies spoke to you?
Don't know. I can't even, I mean, I got yelled at by Google in May. They said, oh, you should have called us. And, you know, I wrote a little piece about this money stuff. They call, you know, I got this really bossy email. Wow. First time, which said, hey, Anya, I want a correction. And I was so shocked. You know, I'm used to being Professor Schiffrin. And I thought, do I know this person? And then I realized, and the funny, and then, you know, and you should have called us for comment. And of course, had they even read down to paragraph 8, that was where I said, Google refused to comment. Yeah. So that was, I don't know, but that was the only time I've ever heard from them, and it wasn't very nice.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, let's go. Someone has the mic at the back. Yeah.
Hello, thanks. My name is Nisora. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I really wanted to touch briefly on civil society, as it was mentioned in passing. And my question is really whether civil society creates an environment where misinformation and disinformation have a perfect environment to breed, or whether it provides a great opportunity for people to be informed when we talk about, for example, framing or measurement or wording effects on people who don't really speak the language or who may have less access to some sort of media outlets than others.
I personally am a big believer in civil society. I think it's really important because there's a major trust factor, right? Especially if it is, you know, an immigrant group or a small, very sort of insular group. I think civil society can be the way, even if somebody in the group is not an expert, if they bring in an expert and that expert is vouched for as, you know, the person who can speak to COVID, you know, what is going on with COVID, or somebody who can speak to climate change and why we need to be more responsible, that I think is a more trusted way to get, it's a small number of people at any one stint, but they'll carry the water for you elsewhere, right? So, you know, civil society groups, you know, if there's a meeting of 25 people, they might inform 25 times 5 people each or 10 people each, and they will carry your water for you. Now, there could be a little telephone game issue in that, but I personally am a big believer in sort of that personal use of civil society to inform, to educate, and to help educate, groups that might not be engaged with otherwise.
Can I make a couple of points on that? I think you made some very important points. I have done some research around civility in America. And what we found with particularly mobile phones, different than laptops, different than tablets, and certainly different, to your point about putting the phone down, peer-to-peer communications in person, is there's a slippery slope. People feel empowered to be able to go and type things that they would never in a million years email out on a desktop, laptop, and certainly not say to people's faces. There's something about these devices which makes us more inclined to be willing to take some of those barriers away and down. I think the second point is I was on a similar panel at Harvard. I'm a Democrat, and somebody said, this is all Trump, right? He said fake news, and there's no putting the genie back. And yes, he deserves a great deal of blame for this. What I've tried to do in thinking about this issue and thinking about this panel and the others that I participated in is there is an enormous amount of dislocation that's taking place across this country, taking place around the world. And that's economic dislocation, it's social dislocation, it's cultural dislocation. And there are various strains of that, and different people react to that differently. I think we are more susceptible to disinformation, to misinformation, because where we are in history, you can look at the Industrial Revolution as a similar example of dislocation. So I keep coming back and saying I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because we're going through a period of tremendous transformation right now, and our minds can't keep up with it. And so I think we are weaker and more susceptible to disinformation. And I think when the world rights itself, it will be somewhat self-correcting. I'm not that optimistic that says it's going to happen by itself. And that means I should stop talking.
I think we have time for one more question. We have one right there. Yep.
Oh, hello. My name is Yakira Young, and I'm actually an advertising technology reporter at Ad Monsters, sister brand of Ad Exchanger. And we also host panels like this one, so like the topic was very close to home to me. We recently published a playbook alongside GeoEdge, an advertising technology company, about this topic. And one thing that we highlighted is that experts refer to generative AI as a political superweapon. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that and know like how publishers can use generative AI to actually spread facts the right way or use it in a more positive light.
When you say publishers, do you mean like the traditional media, sort of institution of traditional media, or do you mean like marketing, like I want to sell more Colgate toothpaste? Like where? I mean, I don't think we should be using generative AI to sell people anything, is my position. Now, if I put on my like, US government, we want to go be righteous overseas, like I totally want generative AI so that I can push a very personalized message to a very particular individual using all of their biometric and like all of their data that they've just given to social media companies over the last 20 years. Like I want to use that, but I don't think we should be in our society using that to like sell people or things. I think we need to have a discussion about ethics on that, which I don't think we haven't gotten there in terms of the big AI topic, let alone generative in our academia, ivory tower or elsewhere. That's just me.
I was going to say, I can't speak to marketing, but over the past couple of months, I've, with Don Green in our department and a researcher, Samar Sevi, we've been building a chatbot that provides people with information about the party platforms and provides it in a fairly neutral fashion. So people can ask the bot, like, where do the parties stand on these issues? It's not supposed to provide any kind of lean or direction, just supposed to provide information derived from party platforms. And so this is not, in the realm of marketing, but I think in the realm of politics, there are ways in which it can maybe enhance civic knowledge and engagement. You could imagine, you know, local politics is a mess. It's really hard to figure out what's going on. So if there are ways to simplify that information through summaries, weekly summaries of what's going on in New York City politics, I think we shouldn't just simply view generative AI as a risk. I think there are some opportunities as well.
I think we could also bring back the local newspaper to manage a lot of those issues too, right? Like we're back to the local journalism, responsible local journalism to fill some of those gaps.
I think just a couple of thoughts, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. I think that it comes back to corporate reputation. There's a story today, I think in the Wall Street Journal, about how Meta was trying to develop an AI chatbot, and one of the answers that it spit back was the history of how bears go hunting and how they find food in outer space. And it was so laughable that if they had come out with something like that publicly, they would have been scorned. I think the other example, which you'll understand, and others I hope to explain it to, is there is a very flashy set of events, I'd love to get tickets to everybody for this, called the TV Upfronts. And what it is it's the traditional broadcast media outlets selling TV advertising for the year ahead. And TV viewership is going down. The cost of buying each spot is going up. The upfronts, you can't get a ticket to it, you can't get in there. Why? Because if you're a corporate advertiser and you're buying the 6 o'clock news, you know that you're not going to be next to crazy white supremacist content in a way that if you're advertising one of the channels, you do. So it comes back to, I think, corporate reputation. Companies and brands do so much work to protect their images that there's a sense of certainty. So I think the publishers need to be very, very careful about automating programmatic advertising, which I know is cheaper and more cost-effective, opens companies and brands up to huge reputational risk, and why they're relying on arguably more expensive, less effective advertising for the sake of peace and sanity.
Thank you so much. I believe we're exactly 1 minute over time. So all things considered, I think we did a pretty good job. So all that remains for me to do is express my profound thanks for the panelists tonight, for your insights, your expertise, your enthusiasm, your optimism, and your measured pessimism too. Thank you so much to SPS, all the administrators and all the faculty who helped tonight happen. And of course, thank you so much to all of you for coming along. And I must say that if there is a glimmer of optimism that I have tonight, it is at the enthusiasm and the interest in this topic that you've all showed tonight. So thank you so much for coming.